Welcome everyone to this edition of the History of Christianity Season 2. We're on Part 9 today. Up to this point, we've talked about the two major branches of the Protestant Reformation that took place on the European continent. That is the Reform started by Luther, that took place primarily in Germany, and of course it spread from there. And then the second branch was begun by Ulrich Zwingli, and after his death was taken over by John Calvin, and that would be the Reformed tradition. So we've got the Lutherans and the Reformed, but there's still one major branch we haven't got to yet, and that is the Reformation in Great Britain. So today we'll be looking at that. And we start by looking at what was going on in Great Britain during the 16th century. In the 16th century, Great Britain was divided between the House of Tudor in England and the Stuart Kingdom of Scotland. So today we're going to talk about the English part of this. We'll do Scotland next week. Scotland was an ally of France and England was an ally of Spain. They were definitely not on the same page, and they allied themselves with different European countries because of the fact that they didn't get along themselves. So we have Scotland, who paired off with France, and of course England's not going to be friends with anybody that's friends with France. And then England was paired up with Spain. In order to strengthen ties to Spain, King Henry VII arranged a marriage between his son Arthur to Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. This should have sealed relations between England and Spain, but Arthur died 4 months after the wedding. So you have to understand the big selling point of this marriage was that Arthur was the heir to the throne of England. And so it wasn't going to do for Catherine to be married to just anybody in the royal family. She was married to the guy that was next in line for the throne. She was going to be queen. Well, when he dies, that takes that off the table. So what do you do about it? Spain proposed that Catherine marry Henry VII's younger son, Henry VIII, who now is going to be the heir to the throne of England. So he's kind of the next man up. Now, he's a lot younger. He's not ready to be married yet, but they can wait until he's ready. That leaves Catherine back in the same position she was in before. It's going to be the queen, and it strengthens those ties between England and Spain. Well, there's a problem with this. Since canon law prohibited a man's marriage to his brother's widow, the English representatives in Rome obtained a papal dispensation. As soon as Henry VIII was old enough, he was married to Catherine. So the religious law said you can't do this. A man should not marry his brother's widow. So English representatives in Rome went to the Pope and said, hey, got this problem. We want to make Spain happy. As you'll see in a few moments, the Pope is very interested in making Spain happy as well. So he's all too eager to go along with this, and he does. He gives them permission to do it. And so Henry VIII, when he was old enough, goes along with the plan, and he's married to his brother's widow, Catherine, which puts her back in to be the queen, in line with Henry VIII to the throne. And so everything should have been happily ever after from there. Well, obviously that's not quite how it turned out. The first problem was that some doubted the Pope had the power to grant dispensation for Henry to marry his brother's widow. There were those who said, well, wait a minute, it doesn't matter whether the Pope said it's okay. You still can't do it. The law says it's not okay. And this caused there to be some doubt about the legality of the marriage. So you've got people talking about, well, this marriage isn't even legal. It's not even valid. But I'll add to that the fact that Henry VIII and Catherine were not able to produce a male heir. That you had people talking about, well, see there, God's punishing them. Of course, he's not going to allow them to have a male heir because they're not legally married. This marriage is not valid. So that caused a lot of strain on the marriage. The marriage wasn't a happy one anyway. And so several solutions were proposed in hopes of producing a male heir. So you know anything about early history of England at this period of time, I guess I shouldn't say early, but this time, Henry VIII is known for being the king that brings in all the wives. And he has some creative and interesting ways to get his new wives that don't necessarily turn out all that great for the wives. But this is where this all started from. There was the need for a clear line of succession. There had been some problems in England's past, and it had actually been a lot of bloodshed over what the line of succession should be, and people didn't want that. Obviously, the king didn't want that. He wants his heirs to continue to reign, But the people in charge didn't want it. They didn't want that to happen again. And so they're very invested in making sure that Henry's the king, he's going to have a male heir. And that way we can keep this line of succession going. So there were those who wanted to help to figure out how to make sure this happened. And there were some different solutions proposed for this. First of all, Henry's solution was to have his bastard son declared legitimate and made his heir. So he had had a son outside of wedlock who was not legitimate. And he just said, well, I've already got a male son. We don't even have to worry about getting one. We'll just let him be the heir. Well, the Pope had to come along and go along with that. And he's already got himself in trouble because he said that it was okay for Henry to marry Catherine. And remember, the Pope, again, we're going to get to this more in a moment, but the Pope is trying to keep Spain happy. So do you think Catherine wants Henry's illegitimate son to be in the line for the throne after him? Well, no, she doesn't want that. And the Pope's not going to go against what Spain wants. So he's not going to do it. Now, again, none of this stuff, as we look through it at this period of time, it doesn't have to do with morality. It doesn't have to do with convictions typically. It has to do with politics and power plays. And it's just a ridiculous time in church history. This Pope, he doesn't care about whether it's right or wrong. He goes along with whoever's going to help him at the time. If Henry's going to be the most help to him and he wants to get him married off to the royal family's daughter in Spain and that makes Spain happy, then the Pope says, of course I'll go along with that. I'll throw this out there. He can do it. If it's not going to make them happy and Henry wants his son legitimized, well, no, I'm not going to do that. There's no rhyme or reason to it. There's no rules that matter. They use the rules out of convenience to make people happy or go against people they don't like. But it's nonsense. It's a lot of nonsense. And this is what leads to ultimately having the Protestant Reformation in England. It's crazy. So let's move on through this. The cardinal in charge of negotiations then suggested that Henry's son marry his own half-sister Mary. Well, there's a great idea. Let's just get Henry's son to hook up with... Oh my goodness, this is crazy. Let's get Henry's son to hook up, the illegitimate son to hook up with his legitimate daughter, and that brings legitimacy to the whole thing. Yeah, that's a great idea. A son marries his half-sister. Well, thankfully, at least Henry had enough sense to know not to do this. He said no. And, what's the reason? Is it because, well, he didn't want his two kids to be married? No, that wasn't really it. He just thought it would be more confusing. And he was already in a confusing position being married to his brother's widow, which he wasn't supposed to do either. So, again, just crazy stuff going on. But, at least Henry did say, no, this is ridiculous. We can't do that. He wasn't willing to go that far. And, but at the same time, if conditions had been a little different, if he thought he could get away with it, he probably would have done it. But he didn't, so they moved on from that. Finally, Henry requested that Rome annul his marriage with Catherine, leaving him free to marry a queen who could produce a male heir. Such annulments were not uncommon. It'd been no problem for the Pope to do this. It wasn't like it was some big religious conviction that he had that, no, I won't go for divorce or annulment. No, he would do it. If it had been in his best interest in his mind, this Pope would have done it in a heartbeat. But it wasn't, because it would get Spain upset. And the reason for that is, well, first of all, the argument for this was that the marriage was never illicit to begin with and was therefore never a true marriage. So it wasn't even really annulment. I mean, it was, but it was more just saying, well, that marriage never was real anyway. They weren't supposed to get married. We knew they weren't supposed to get married. The Pope didn't have any business telling them they could get married, but he did. So let's just say it didn't count. It wasn't a real marriage. Well, that's an easy solution, except for one problem. The Pope was under the thumb of Charles V. Charles V was the emperor. He was the big political head at that time in Europe. And he also happened to be the nephew of Catherine. So she goes to Charles and says, hey, I'm about to get thrown out the door. And I already got thrown out the door one time with the brother Arthur dying. I thought I was out then. I finagled my way back in, and now I'm about to be kicked out again. Will you please help me? And, of course, he did. So this Pope, this was Clement VII, he wasn't going to alienate Charles V. So Charles told him, nope, don't go along with this. I don't want it. So what did the Pope do? Did he stand up and say, no, you can't do this? Did he stand up and make some kind of a firm proclamation? Did he stand on moral principles? No, he just didn't make a decision. He just decided, he just kept on prolonging. Well, I'll tell you next week. Well, let's get together next month. He kept prolonging it. He kept putting it off. So he didn't get either side mad when actually it worked out for Spain's side, but not for Henry's side. So this Pope is a pretty gutless dude. Henry VIII consulted the main Catholic universities. All of them agreed that Henry's marriage to Catherine was not valid. So his thinking was, okay, the Pope's not going to give me an answer, so I'll just go find the answer myself. So let me go to the guys that know more about church law, more about church doctrine and theology than anybody else. And that would have been the heads of these major Catholic universities. And they all said the same thing. They said, no, yeah, the Pope can't do that. This marriage is not valid. And so in Henry's mind, that's all he needed. From that point on, Henry VIII followed a policy that would eventually lead to a break with Rome. Ancient laws forbidding appeals to Rome were reenacted, putting the clergy more directly under the king's authority. So the king basically said, if you don't agree with me, you can't appeal to Rome. You can't go to the Pope. You can't get the Pope to intercede for you. You're going to have to work it out with me. Well, that takes those church leaders and puts them way more beholden now to Henry than they are the Pope. The Pope can't do anything for them. In the past, they could have just gone to the Pope and said, hey, this King Henry is causing us problems. Would you step in? Well, now Henry said you can't do that. And that's the first step. And eventually, this is a break that's going to continue to fracture. And not much longer after this, it's going to break completely. These conflicts with the papacy did not mean that Henry had any sympathy at all for Protestantism. A few years earlier, he had even published a treatise against Luther. Henry did not seek a reformation, but rather a restoration of the rights of the crown against undue papal intervention. So this is more of going back to the church and state deal. Should there be separation of church and state? Well, we've seen through the history. If you've been in the study, I hope you finally realized, you probably already know, I shouldn't put it that way, but I hope it reinforces the idea that the church and the state need to be separate. Doesn't mean that the church shouldn't have influence in the culture, but it does mean that they have a proper place. And the state doesn't need to be getting involved in the church stuff, and the church doesn't need to be getting involved in the state stuff and running the civil government. It just doesn't work out well. You see it through this history. And here we go. We've got this problem because here's Henry, who has no interest in being Protestant. He doesn't care about Luther. He doesn't like Luther. He doesn't like the Protestant Reformation. He wants to stay Catholic. He's very conservative religiously. But he can't stay Catholic because he can't do what he wants to do. He can't be the king everybody wants him to be. He can't ditch this wife. So he's going to make a move away from the Catholic Church, not because of principles, not because of a need for reform, not because of corruption. He's as corrupt as any of them. He's doing it just purely for selfish means. So it puts a light on the way the Protestant Reformation happened in England. It happened differently there than it did in these other places. The leaders of the Protestant Reformation in Germany and Switzerland all of those leaders were very convicted, and they were following what they felt the scriptures taught. Here in England, it's not like that. Now, we're going to see in a moment that didn't mean there weren't people that did feel that way, and that were kind of the grassroots movement of the Protestant Reformation in England, really got changes made. They were there for sure. But the impetus of it, the person who really drove that is a guy who's doing it purely for political and selfish reasons. So it's going to just look a little bit differently, and we'll see how that turns out as we go. So eventually the break with Rome did happen. Lutheran ideas, joined with those of Wycliffe, were circulating in England. So these ideas were there. They had heard them. They weren't hidden at all. And there were definitely people in England that wanted a Protestant Reformation there. They wanted it to spread to England, and they were very interested. They didn't care how it happened. If it happened because the king was stupid and needed to be married again, then great. If that gets us to where we want to be, then that's fine. Wycliffe's reform program included the creation of a national church under the direction of civil authorities. Henry's policies were leading in that direction, so that made these Protestant leaders happy. They wanted to go along with what Wycliffe believed, and Wycliffe thought that there should be a national church. Well, everything that is going on with Henry is putting that church more and more into the hands of civil authorities under the leadership of the king, because the king needs it to do what he says it should do. So even though it's not for the right reason, it still gets you to the point you want to be. So these reformers in England are pretty happy about what's happening right now. The final break occurred in 1534 when Parliament, following the direction of the king, enacted a series of laws forbidding the payment of annates and other such contributions to Rome, ruling that Henry's marriage was not a true marriage and that the king was the supreme head of the Church of England. Now let me go back and explain what these annates were. Basically, what would happen is if a person was put into an ecclesiastical post, it was typical that they would, for their first year, they would pay a tax on their salary to the bishop or directly to the pope who had put them in that position. So this is kind of like, this is a little kickback that they would send to the person who put them in place. So it amounted to, well, hey, if you give me that position, I'll give you a percentage of my first year's salary. Or more likely, the person would go to them and say, hey, I put you in this good position. You'll make some good money doing it. You won't have to do a lot of work. But in order for me to do that, I'm going to need something from you too. So why don't you just give me a tax off your first year's salary? And this was common practice at the time. It was something that happened. It's a ridiculous concept. It's absolutely, if you look, like in the mobster world, it's getting a piece of the action. These guys got it. And they would even make deals. It was typical it'd be a year, but there'd be some of them who would, if it was a really great post, they may tell them 5 years. You know what? The first 5 years, I want that piece of the action. I want you to send some my way. And it actually started with the bishops, and the Pope found out about it and said he wanted to get in on it. And so they started having to do it for the Pope too. Well, here's Henry, and he's smart. He's thinking, I'm gonna hit him in the wallet. This is going to high leadership in the church. And so I'm going to just make a law or put a series of laws in place that say you can't pay those. Any kind of contributions like that, they're illegal to pay them. So you can put people in whatever post you want to. It doesn't matter. They're not paying you anything. And so that probably, of all this stuff, that's probably the biggest thing they were concerned about. The Pope didn't care anything about Henry's marriage. He just wanted to stay in good standing with Spain, so he didn't care that they declared that. Now, he didn't want the king being called the supreme head of the Church of England. I can promise you that much. So this is it. You can't go back from this. They've broken now, and they've moved on. The Catholic Church is out, and the Church of England is in. Parliament also decreed that anyone who called the king a schismatic or a heretic would be guilty of treason. So a schismatic would be somebody who caused a schism or caused a break. And if you accuse the king of, well, you broke us off from the church, you caused us to have a split, that was illegal. You couldn't do that. And you also couldn't call him a heretic. If you called him a heretic or something of that nature, then you're either one of those things. You're guilty of treason, and you're out. And you're going to be in trouble, as we'll see. Sir Thomas More, who had been chancellor and a good friend of Henry VIII, opposed these new laws. So here's a guy, he had been in a high-level position in the government. He was good friends with Henry VIII. They were friends. But he said he was loyal to what he believed and was right about the church. And he said, well, wait a minute, you can't do that. These laws are not right. And so he refused to swear loyalty to the king as head of the church. Now, his defense as he goes through this is, I never said that it was wrong for Henry to be head of the church. I never even said that he wasn't. I just wouldn't affirm it. I wouldn't swear loyalty. I wouldn't say that it was correct. But that didn't matter. They came back to him. He refused to recant, and then he was eventually executed. So didn't matter that he was buddies with the king. If you cross the king, you're dead meat. And he did, and he ended up dying. And coincidentally, eventually he became recognized as a saint in the Catholic Church as a result of this. At first, this was nothing more than a schism with no attempt at reformation. But there were those in England who did see the need for reformation and who saw these events as an opportunity to achieve it. Thomas Cranmer, the king's main advisor in religious matters, was typical of this attitude. So the king did have a guy who was high up in the church and who he was listening to about religious matters, who wanted to see change made. And so these people, even though they weren't the king who kind of created the Protestant Reformation in the country, or was the one behind it actually coming into being, these were the people that actually made the Reformation part of it happen, not just a split. And at first, with Henry, all it was in his mind was just splitting from the Catholic Church because of the Pope. He would have rather the Church of England just did everything exactly the way the Catholic Church had always done it, other than the stuff he didn't like, of course, and just remain like that. But that wasn't going to happen, because there were too many people in positions of leadership who saw this as their time. This was their moment to get in and really get reform going on in the church in England. And they did. And so as a result of that split became an actual Reformation. Even though it didn't start for the right reason, it ended up being a good thing when it was all said and done. Yet Henry VIII was conservative on religious matters. During his reign, the laws having to do with religion wavered according to changing political considerations. And that's what Henry was about. He was about politics. He was about power. He was about keeping his reign going. And religion was just a pawn in his game. He may have been conservative in his beliefs, but he wasn't no problem with going against those conservative beliefs if it helped him out. And he did. So you got not the most noble cause, not the most noble person in charge, but you're getting to the Reformation part that people wanted. And eventually it does create some big changes in England. But we can't go on without looking at the marriages of Henry VIII. These marriages drove the bus when it came to the Protestant Reformation. As crazy as that is, with the actual split from the church in Rome, it was all because of these marriages. And Henry VIII was a man who was going to be married several times. He was kind of Elizabeth Taylor of his day, 6 marriages in all. And there were some creative ways he got around to these marriages. So let's look at them. You probably remember some of this from history class when you were younger. As soon as Henry was made head of the church, he declared his marriage to Catherine void. Of course, that was the whole reason he was made head of the church. He then regularized his secret marriage to Anne Boleyn that had already taken place. He was actually already married to Anne Boleyn. And he did it based on this information he had received that the original marriage was not valid. So for Henry, if it's not valid, then he's not married. There may be a woman living there in his house that says he's the king, she's the queen, but if she's not really his wife, then he can go get married to whoever he wanted, and he did. And now that he's the head of the church, he doesn't have to hide it anymore. He can just come right out with it, and he did. And so he was married now. Catherine's out, Anne Boleyn is in. Anne gave him a daughter, Elizabeth, obviously a big figure in history we'll get to, but she didn't produce a male heir. So unfortunately for Anne, she had to go. So she was accused of adultery and condemned to death. That was the easy way to get rid of a wife. If you have the power to do it, nobody's going to stand up against you. You can make any accusation you want, and the king could do that. So she's an adulteress, kill her. And he did, and on he went to the next one. The king next married Jane Seymour, who gave him a male heir, Edward VI. So you're probably thinking, well, why does he keep getting married then? Why didn't it stop right there? He got what he wanted. Third time's the charm. He's got his male heir. Well, it didn't keep going because Jane Seymour died. And Henry then, he didn't need a male heir anymore. So he wasn't going to get married just for that reason. But now he can move to what a lot of these kings did, and that was position themselves strategically in political affairs. So his reasoning was that he wanted to get in good with the German Lutherans because they were against, obviously, the Pope and the Catholic Church and his enemies in France. And so he decided to marry Anne of Cleves. And he marries her to get in good with these German Lutherans so that they can be his allies when it comes to dealing with Charles V and the Pope and Francis over in France, the king there. And he thinks this is going to be a good idea, but it didn't turn out that way. When it became apparent that the Lutherans insisted on their doctrinal positions, though Henry was opposed to them, he divorced Anne, then ordered that the man who had arranged the marriage be beheaded. So Anne maybe got off good here. She didn't get beheaded, but the guy that brought her in did. Henry decided it was more trouble than it was worth to deal with these German Lutherans. They were insistent on pushing their Protestant reform into what Henry was doing. And again, Henry wasn't interested in any of that. He wanted things to stay status quo as much as they could. So he finally decides the Jews ain't worth the squeeze with this group. And he sends Anne packing. She's gone. And the guy that said, hey, it'd be a good idea to marry Anne of Cleves, well, he was minus a head. Next, Henry married Catherine Howard, who supported the conservative position. This opened a period of difficulties for those interested in reform. Henry broke all ties with Lutheran leaders and took steps to make the Church of England conform as much as possible with the Catholic Church. And this is really what he wanted. Now he's got a wife that supports it too. She's not over with the Lutherans. She's very conservative. She's more on the Catholic side of things. And while he's married to Catherine Howard, the reformer movement's not going to go too well. But Catherine fell into disgrace, and she got beheaded too. So things didn't work out for her. Off with her head. And then that's 5. So been married 5 times now. You'd think that's got to be enough, but it wasn't. Henry decides he's going to do it one more time. And so he marries Catherine Parr. And she's the opposite of Catherine Howard. She is a supporter of Reformation. So King Henry's last wife, who is going to be in a position of authority, she's not going to take over as king, but she still was the queen when Henry died, which he did in 1547. She is a sympathizer with the Protestant Reformation movement. So this is good. It left those who opposed reform in a precarious position. So those that were part of the more conservative group, that kind of everything was going really good with them with Catherine Howard. Now they're not in a great position. The last wife with King Henry pushed reform, and that's kind of what the last word on his legacy was. He was wishy-washy. He went back and forth with the wind blowing, but you kind of remember the last thing that somebody did, the way they finished. And the tone of things at the time was that reform was in the air. And so the conservative group, they weren't in good shape. But of course, the winds of history do blow in different directions, and you never know why or how. And things are going to change, of course, going forward. But before we look at that, let's look at just some things about the Reformation in England at the time. During the years of Henry's reign, both with and without the king's support, ideas of Reformation spread. So this was truly a grassroots movement. The person that would be the de facto leader of it, the king, really wasn't all that involved in it in a positive way. It was those that were underneath him, those on the ground, that were about getting this Reformation spread. Cranmer had ordered that the Bible be translated into English. A great English Bible was placed in every church at a place where all could read it. So all of a sudden people can read the scripture. Well, that plays into the Protestants' hands because they could use it to advocate for reform. They went throughout the country drawing attention to passages in scripture that supported their teachings and goals. So now that people they don't have to just be read the Bible. They don't have to find somebody who can read Latin to read it to them and tell them what it says. They can actually read it for themselves and say, well, wait a minute, that's not what I've been hearing my whole life. What does that say right there? And this was a big tool that was used in England to bring people around towards the Reformation. Look at the scripture. You can actually read it now. It's a big game changer for sure. The suppression of monasteries deprived the conservative wing of its staunchest allies. So just kind of keeping that Catholic influence down was a big thing at this time. The Humanists, both numerous and powerful, saw in the king's policies an opportunity to achieve a Reformation without what they considered to be German Protestant excesses. So these Humanists, they were led by the thinking of Erasmus. And remember, Erasmus was the guy, he wanted reform, but he didn't want to split. He thought the church could be reformed from within. And these Humanists, they're about reform now, and they're not necessarily opposed to starting something new, but they don't want to go as far as the German Protestant movement, the Lutherans did. They thought they went too far. They wanted to try to keep things more, closer to tradition, but yet they still were very much in support of reform, so they're going to help drive this boat as well. The net result was that at the time of Henry's death, the advocates of reform had gained ample support throughout the kingdom. So things are setting up very nicely for the Reformation movement, and they're going to continue to set up under King Henry VIII's heir, and we know that's Edward VI. Henry and Parliament agreed that he would be succeeded by his only male heir, Edward, and then by his two daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, in order of their birth. Edward was a sickly young man. He lived only 6 years after his father's death. So Edward did take over, but he was sick. And he didn't live a long time after his father's death, so this little succession plan is going to come into effect. The first 3 years of Edward's reign under the regency of the Duke of Somerset were a period of great advances for the Reformation cause. So this Duke of Somerset, he was very, very much into the reform. And he's helping guide young Edward. Edward's not quite old enough to be able to handle things on his own, and he's going to help really push the Reformation. So they got a good 3 years of that. The cup and communion was restored to the laity. Members of the clergy were allowed to marry, and images were taken out of the church. So some big accomplishments that happened early on in Edward's reign definitely went in favor of the Protestants. The most important achievement under the Duke of Somerset was the publication of the Book of Common Prayer. The book was authored primarily by Cranmer. For the first time, the English people had a liturgy in their own language. So this was a big deal. This book being printed and put out there, it was the liturgy for the people. They could read it in their own language, and finally they've got that now. Following Somerset, the regency fell into the hands of the Duke of Northumberland. Though he did not share the principles of his predecessor, he continued the process of Reformation. So his policies stayed in favor of the reform movement. He didn't necessarily care about it like the Duke of Somerset did, but it was politically expedient for him to continue on that same path. So it worked out again for the Protestants in this case. But during his regency, a revised edition of the Book of Common Prayer was published. The section which instructs the ministers what to say in communion shows a Zwinglian influence. So this is going to be even further down the reform path. And this guy, this Duke, he's supervising things when this is going on. So the Protestants are really making some big advances at this time. And let me give you an example of what the changes were in the communion instructions that really show how Zwingli's thoughts were incorporated. The first edition states, "The body of our Lord Jesus Christ, which was given for thee, preserve thy body and soul unto everlasting life." You can take that statement and kind of read it. You can read it in the way the Catholics would look at it, transubstantiation as the actual body and blood of Jesus, or you could read it like Luther thought about it, that, you know, the body's there, but it's not completely there. It's both. It doesn't really change, but the body's still there. And also even Calvin's ideas. So you could kind of, there's some wiggle room here. But the new wording really doesn't do that. The new wording was, "Take and eat this in remembrance that Christ died for thee, and feed on him in thy heart by faith with thanksgiving." So that's very much a symbolic representation. There's no ambiguity in that one. This is saying that the elements are strictly symbolic, and that their purpose are to help us to remember what Christ did for us. So you see this Protestant movement in England is moving really far into Reformed theology at this point. It's Zwingli's ideas. And it's getting away even from some of that, you know, let's try to kind of keep status quo. It's moving at this time, and the Protestants are feeling really good about themselves. But we all know that what's coming is not going to stay that way. This new wording points to the direction in which things were moving in England. The leaders of the Reformist Party had reason to hope their cause would win without great opposition, but upon Edward's death, remember that succession plan, the crown fell to Mary. She's the daughter of Catherine in Spain. The Spanish people are big-time supporters of the Catholic Church, and she had always been raised a Catholic. So now, as things have happened, the worst thing in the world for the Protestants could happen. The king's death takes a guy who was sympathetic to the Protestant Reformation out of the picture, and it puts a queen on the throne who is hardcore, staunchly Catholic. So that's where we're going to leave things today. Thanks for joining me for and looking at these things about the Church of England. We're going to jump in next week to look at Mary and also Elizabeth and see what their reigns did for the Protestant Reformation in England. And then we're going to talk about Scotland. There's a little bit different path to Reformation in Scotland than there was in England because they were two separate countries at that time. So we'll do all of that next week. Thanks again for joining me today. God bless.